9 times out of 10, you're going to have a very difficult time convincing people that a project around deception is the right form of defense from a security perspective.
But modern deception is no longer just about isolated honeypots, and then frameworks like MITRE really bring strategic coherence and integration into active defense operations. Under HIPAA, for example, security controls must be proportional and justifiable. And deception basically qualifies as a reasonable security and safeguard. Internal usage of deception should be framed within acceptable use policies and may require internal governance board reviews.
Don't you think that a lot of our honeypot programs and deception programs today tend to focus exclusively on external threats? You don't just have to catch someone in the act. Intelligence is about knowing what's their next move. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're joining us. I'm joining you from the town of Ajax in Canada. My colleague Sivan is joining you from somewhere in North America. And I want to begin by acknowledging that the online space constitutes indigenous space as our infrastructure runs across these land, seas, and skies. And I encourage all of you to take the time to learn about wherever you are in the world, to learn about the indigenous histories or the local stories that have brought us to the point that we find ourselves at today. I have 30 minutes, so I'm just going to jump right into it. I'll take the first minute to set the context. Walk into an executive room as a technical expert and tell them you have a project that uses deception from a cyber perspective. And I can guarantee you, not a lot of money, but some monopoly money, that 9 times out of 10, you're going to have a very difficult time convincing people that a project around deception is the right form of defense from a security perspective. But if I'm in the room, you probably hear me say something like, deception is not about lying, it's about leading to the truth. And in my opinion, it's about leading to the truth around how your adversaries are potentially trying to find their way through your systems. So in the next 29 minutes now, I'll make sure to work very closely with Sivan to help you understand that if you are thinking about some sort of honeypot, some sort of programs along those areas, how exactly should you be going about it? And what are at least 5 critical questions from a technical and operational perspective that you should be asking? My name is Ali, and I'm humbled and honored to be the moderator of this session. I'll turn it over to Sivan to have her introduce herself and also tell me from her perspective for a minute or two, why is this an important subject for today? Sivan?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me, Ali. My name is Sivan Tehila. I'm the CEO and founder of Onyxia Cyber. We're a cyber defense platform powered by AI. Of course, we're going to talk about that today as well. And I'm also the program director for the master's degree in cybersecurity at YU. I'm based in New York, and today I'm connecting from Boston, and I'm excited to talk about the art of deception. Honeypots and deception is obviously always an important topic in cybersecurity, and it's really about the art of lying to attackers in order to protect the truth, like you said. There are many ways to do that. There are many reasons why we want to do that. And when we're looking at things from an enterprise perspective, we often talk about mainly defense, but we're always talk about the basics and the different frameworks we need to use. It's always obviously super important to put ourselves in the place of attackers and try to understand not only how they think, but also try to get them and put those traps in order to confuse them or mislead them in order not to get into our environment. So I'm excited about the topic. Look forward to share some insights and obviously learn from you, Ali. And let's get it going.
So you mentioned an important word there, and you said the word frameworks. And I want to take a couple of moments to just dissect that in as much depth as I can. You've had your traditional honeypots that we've kept in place to see if somebody attempts to log in, and maybe we can look at some of their activities and how they're trying to live off the land, so on and so forth. But I have a question for you, especially at the master's level at the university. You've probably been dealing with something called MITRE Engage. I just did a session this morning on MITRE Atlas, so I'm happy to be talking about MITRE again. But help us understand a little bit about how should we be thinking through MITRE Engage if we actually want to use that as a framework to develop our modernized honeypots.
Yeah, and I think MITRE is obviously one of the main frameworks out there. MITRE Engage is specifically related to our topic today. And we see that modern deception is no longer just about isolated honeypots. And frameworks like MITRE really bring strategic coherence and integration into active defense operations. And the way we really use them and how we change the game is first, we see that threat actor engagement. So MITRE is really about engage, emphasizes not just luring attackers, but shaping their decisions, increasing dwell time, and feeding false data. We also see that dynamic honeypots, which is basically, these are more of the context-aware traps. So fake API keys, credentials, or documents, and we usually place them in live environments. And when attacker touch them, they provide high fidelity alerts without spinning up a full honeypot. So that's another way. And we also see a concept that is related to MITRE Engage, and that's deception as intelligence. And that means that instead of forcibly observing threats, deception is now used to basically extract TTPS and understand the behavior of the attacker and simulate a breach scenario, for example, in near real time. And the last thing is when, we see that integrating those with SOAR and XDR, for example, that can help us get modern deception or leverage modern deception tools that integrate with detection pipelines, and then it can enrich and automate the steps when traps are basically triggered. So very a lot of information, but I would love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think for me, the bigger thing is that if you go back historically, and again, we teach this a lot in the classroom as well, is when you look at honeypots as they were traditionally used, sort of isolated, more almost as a alert mechanism where, oh, somebody's trying something, let's just be on alert. And I think that works. It's almost like, I think traditionally, going back, let's say 10 years or so, the way we looked at honeypots was almost as if you had a camera that was detecting for motion and then saying, some things could be out. There's nothing sensitive over there, but someone's there, so let's have our guard up. But when you look at MITRE Engage today, I think there are really three critical things that we're beginning to see that could be used very well. Firstly is the integration with your tips, with your threat intelligence platform. I think that is super, super important. That allows you not only to create an environment where an attacker could find themselves, but allows you in real time to correlate with what's going on. And all of a sudden now your threat intelligence program and the role of your threat intelligence analyst becomes even more important to you. The reporting that comes out of it, the intelligence that you draw out of it, you can correlate very quickly. And you can probably even, depending on what program you're using or depending on which platform you're using for your threat intel, you can actually communicate with other friendlies in the community to sort of see if they're seeing something like that. So the speed of the response and the correlation with your tips and the integration with your tips, I think is super important. The second piece that I believe today helps you dramatically from a MITRE Engage perspective. And again, you've got to have, look, I'm going to be very upfront about this. This is not something that you just run and you create an environment and say, oh, let's see. It's a program behind it. It's a very specialized approach you need to take. Either you have to be working with a third party, or you have to have a very well equipped uh, threat intelligence team and a vulnerability assessment team to have these in place. But I feel that the other piece is that because now we can integrate within our environments, even if it's to a fake database or something within it, you can see behavior in real time in a real environment. And it allows you to sort of see close to near time behavior or near like likeness behavior that an attacker could be using in your environment, which I think, again, from a behavior analysis standpoint, can be very important for you. And then, lastly, undeniably, is the fact that we can now run these in a way where you can simulate it on the cloud, you can monitor it a lot more effectively, makes it a lot more, in my opinion, a little safer to use, but also expensive at the same time. These are not cheap initiatives to put together, and demonstrating an ROI on it can be a little bit challenging. So, definitely good movements from a MITRE Engage perspective, but there are things that we have to potentially look at. And I'll tell you one of the biggest questions that comes up in my mind, and I'll toss it to you, Sivan. We can run these programs, but at the boardroom, when we say we want to run a program like this, compliance is almost ready to go to battle over this. Because at the end of the day, look, I think compliance understands that security is never static, but it's this dynamic game of shadows. But there is nervousness around such programs because could it put us in contradiction with PHIPAA? Could it put us in contradiction with HIPAA? So I want to hear from your perspective, are there any concerns that these kind of honeypots and deception programs could contravene some of our compliance requirements?
Yeah, so I think before maybe I'll talk about compliance, I do want to say something about governance because boards are really more about, the ability to govern the organization. And when we have a plan or a cybersecurity program, or when we're talking about cybersecurity or honeypots, for example, boards are aware, but I think that often they're not aware of like them in technical capabilities or the things that we're planning to run, and then compliance is always there, right? For example, now everyone are talking about agentic AI, right? And I see already CISOs say that they're not going to let any AI agent run in their environment. So I think it's a lot about education and understanding what the compliance requirements really expect us. And if we're talking specifically about HIPAA or healthcare companies, we see that it's all about intent, transparency, at the end of the day. So if we're not using real PII or PHI in the decoys, we basically, we mitigate the. We're basically reducing the risk. We also need to take into consideration the purpose of justification. And under HIPAA, for example, security controls must be proportional and justifiable. And deception basically qualifies as a reasonable security and safeguard. Again, we can talk about the term like what reasonable security safeguard is, but that's usually how the regulation frame it. We also have the idea of auditability and consent. So we need to make sure that internal usage of deception should be framed within acceptable use policies and may require internal governance board reviews or inclusion in risk management documentation. And when we let the board review those materials, again, it comes with a lot of education, explaining them the technical aspects, if it's an isolated environment, and like what is the potential risk or the potential outcome of a confusion. And at the end, it's about breach response augmentation. So since regulators really assess an organization's response capability, deception can be positioned as a proactive threat detection control. And that really aligned with the reasonable security measures principle under both of the frameworks, to the best of my knowledge. Keep it at.
I'll build, yeah, I'll build on that a
Mm-hmm.
little bit and just say that there's something else that I would tie into over here is, look, there has to be, if you're going to do some of these programs, like I mentioned before, the technical team has to be very clear on the costs that are going to be associated with this, operational and technical. I am firmly of the opinion that this should technically be run through third parties, I have another question on that, which I'll come to later. But I think if we take an example, let's say there's a Canadian healthcare institution and they want to run these honey tokens. You've got to create fake data, synthetic data. You have to integrate it within your environment because that's what makes it that more lucrative honeypot that gives you the footprints of the attackers or prospective attackers. But I think there has to be clear understanding of how much synthetic data you're making, how how that data, if accessed by an unknown person or by an unknown actor, how that is logged, how you work with all of that, and what is the renewals process on that data? How is it isolated from some of your core production environments? I think all of that has to be very, very clearly thought out. And in my opinion, I do think that it depends on which sector you're planning to do some of these honeypots and honey tokens. Some sectors might be a lot less vulnerable or sort of a lot less sensitive to something like this. But I think healthcare, government, excessive PII and PI, and you're going to run into some challenges over there. Sivan, there was something interesting that you also said, and that was you need to have the legal team involved, you need to have the board involved. But don't you think that a lot of our honeypot programs and deception programs today tend to focus exclusively on external threats? Can our same technically designed honeypots and traps also be used for internal threats? What's your perspective, Sivan?
Yeah, I thought, when we discussed this initially, and, I was thinking about the topic, that it's interesting because most of the time when we talk about like internal activities, we're talking about training and awareness, and we're using different tools in order to, make our employees more aware. But sometimes there is an internal threat that it's not about employees who, make a mistake. There are really like, malicious behavior that we can potentially identify by using honeypots. And I think the internal deception is becoming kind of like a frontline defense for insider threat detection, and especially when we're talking about zero trust, hybrid, and remote first companies or setups. And I think the way I think about it is that we can divide it to three. So we have um, one type of internal honeypots, like low noise, high signal. And it can be fake files sharing or credentials or HR documents that can detect curious insiders and compromised accounts, and sometimes even literal movement attempts within minimal false positive. So that's one way of use of those internal threat detections in honeypot. The other one is behavioral anchoring. So by basically using those decoys and systems that shouldn't be accessed under normal operations.
Okay, so Sivan's screen is still stuck, but I apologize for that. But I will sort of move the conversation along for everyone. Again, this is one of the wonders of online events where sometimes you do have to rely on connectivity. And I know that Sivan was traveling, so we'll keep the conversation going. And I'll just extend something that Sivan was saying around using these honeypots and these deception tactics for internal usage and monitoring internal behavior. Now, the one thing that I will say to everyone that's listening is the beauty, if I can use that word, of some of these of running these internally tend to focus around you can understand lateral movement within your environment. Now, the key thing to remember over here is that it's not just about let's look at where the employees are moving to. You create some fake files, they access those fake folders. Intelligence which comes out of honeypots is not just to say, I caught you. It's about trying to identify what's the next possible move of this attacker, albeit them on the inside. So, with that, I think we have Sivan back on. Sivan, I was just telling the audience and picking up from where you left off is and you said it's becoming such an important line of defense for internal threats. These internal threats, if you can run good honeypot programs internally, the benefit of it is to understand the lateral movement of some of your insiders, that disgruntled employee, that employee who may be an insider from a nation state perspective. I think here in Canada, for example, about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we had a case at a couple of hospitals where nurses were accessing patient records that they weren't supposed to, and they were doing it maybe for personal gain, to sell it onwards to insurance, which was one of the theories. I think the key there is you don't just have to catch someone in the act. Intelligence is about knowing what's their next move. And that's what you need to sort of focus in on. So, with that said, Sivan, I do want to follow up what we had discussed about. From an ROI perspective, I'm being very transparent about this. When I get asked how much does something like this cost, my answer, I think it's a funny one. I always say it costs an arm and a leg and your firstborn. It's expensive. It's not cheap. How do we demonstrate an ROI on activities such as these kind of deception activities? Your thoughts, Simon?
Yeah, so measuring things in cyber complicated part, right? We have GRC solutions that quantify risk, and sometimes we're trying to understand what is the cost of implementing a solution or a program and how it's going to potentially affect the company and enable the company. I think when it comes to deception, we see that we have specific metrics that we can look at, and it involves qualitative and quantitative factors. One of them is obviously the mean time to detect reduction. If we're able to use, honeypots and understand how long it takes us to react or detect this suspicious behavior. So that's one aspect. The second part is the cost of false positive avoided compared to other controls. So I think that's another metrics that we see. And it's something that we're doing at the today at Onyxia, trying to measure the cybersecurity program and really have those metrics that we see that are related to that, and insights from attacker behavior can also use to improve detection rules. So that's another aspect, and maybe the last one is the policy changes or control enhancements that are informed by deception data. So there is a lot we can learn from this data. And obviously, it's not just about doing that to understand, the immediate impact, but also there are some things that are more strategic for the organization. And I'm sure you have many examples. So, and I can talk also on the zero trust architecture aspect, which is obviously also something that we see that as a result of those kind of programs and exercises, most of the time companies understand that meaning of zero trust network architecture.
I think that's super important, Sivan. And here's the thing that I have often sort of said to my teams, and especially when we teach these programs as well, is that to really show, I think tabletop exercises now more than just a compliance check, the executive level tabletop exercises are, and this is me speaking, having done this at different levels, you have to be able to show the economic impact, and you have to be able to calculate what that's going to look like. One of the things that I've really enjoyed being the chair alongside people like Octavia Howell and Mark Dillon and Alex and Shrey and all of these names, one of the benefits that I've had about doing Operation Defend the North is that economic impact counter that comes up right at the top. And when people look at that and say, oh, it's 10 million, now it's 15 million, I think people need to understand, again, sector specific. Once you do have an outage, let's say an ICS controller, a SCADA network that's operating utility services, once you go down, it's a pretty hefty toll that you take because of that. And showing and being able to show what you can do preemptively if you're able to gather more intelligence about an incoming attack, I think becomes an extremely important element of security. Now, again, to the technical folks, I will say this when you're pitching your program, and there's a lot of things that we can go into in terms of what's the best way to structure some of your honeypots and honey tokens. But the one thing that I will say is taking a contextually aware financial analysis will allow you to move forward. And look, there's securing the business, and then there's the business of security. If you don't know your numbers, it's very hard to get approvals to get some of these things done, the resourcing and the tools that you need. We have about 3 minutes left, and Sivan, I would definitely not be able to get away with this session if I didn't bring up the elephant in the globe, and that is AI. Now, a lot of people will ask, A, does AI impact? I mean, it does, but how does it impact the way in which we run some of our deception programs? Sivan, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the first things we saw when generative AI started to come up is attackers using it to basically write malicious codes and things like that, right? And um, I think when we talk about honeypots, it's really about identifying those potential vulnerabilities, whether it's like internally or, when we're building those external threat programs. I think there are two ways to look at it. How we as like an organization or defenders of an organization can leverage AI in order to build better programs. The other part of it is like in the same way we're thinking about how to build them is to keep in mind how those potential hackers are using them. I think we see the concept. One of the things that AI enables is really the ability to build adaptive deception. So it's a shift to deception environments that mirror real production systems, including proper data and timing for response and behavioral realism. And also the use of ML, machine learning, to rotate honeypots and simulate user interactions and things like that. So those are things that I saw that companies are leveraging and attackers are leveraging as well. Um, and another interesting concept is the human in the loop deception design. So that basically something the ability to continue leveraging threat intelligence and red
Yeah,
teams to evolve decoy assets based and emerging threats. I know we are short with time, so I want to hear your thoughts on that because
sure.
obviously,
Yeah, I think, very quickly, because we have exactly a minute and a half, I'd say the one thing that you have to be prepared for is that the attackers right now who are also using AI and ML on their side of the fence, there's a concept known as adaptive evasion, and being able to sort of deceiving someone who's trying to deceive you as well. You have to realize that, and of course, Sivan, you know this all too well, that attackers sometimes their attack routes can also be a form of deception. So someone hitting you from one particular angle, you might think that they've fallen for a honey trap, but they're actually just, it could be a combination of human intelligence plus AI. They're actually just sniffing around to determine if you have any of these honeypots in place. The realistic nature of these honeypots becomes such an important piece of engineering that I'm sure we could do an entire workshop on that, and maybe we will. Shout out to the CyberX team. We have a masterclass coming up. Maybe designing effective honeypots that can evade the evaders could be a very interesting topic to go through. I know we've come to the end of time. Well, I always like to close the sessions with something that really stood out to me from what my colleague has shared with me. And as I do with all of my classes, I'll leave you with a bit of a quote. And I always tell my students that in security, knowing the bait is as important as knowing the hook. And you can put out all of these honeypots, but if you can't back it up with the right technology and you can't come to the fight well equipped, you probably don't want to know that you're being monitored or being attacked by someone because you have no systems in place. So before you go into setting up these deception programs, make sure that your core is pretty strong because it will attract a lot of interest. And I'll leave you with one piece of wisdom. If you are running a honey trap program, be careful where you talk about it. Be careful how much you share about it. You never know how you could get tested. With that, I want to thank Sivan for her time. I want to thank the CyberX team for making this happen. And I wish you all a wonderful conference. And if you have any thoughts, please feel free to DM them to myself or to Sivan from Onyxia, and we'll be happy to reply to you on the platform or on LinkedIn. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Sivan. Have a wonderful rest of the conference.
Thank you so much.